Hi everyone and welcome. This explainer is built just for you and your Anglais Monde Contemporain course. Today, we're going to tackle a really fundamental tension in modern democracies, that super complex relationship between terrorism, security, and of course, our individual freedoms. So let's kick things off with a really powerful idea from one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. This quote, it just perfectly frames the dilemma we're exploring. I mean, where do we draw the line between being safe and being free? It's a question that's become, more urgent than ever in the 21st century. All right, so where does this fit into your AMC program? Well, we are right in the middle of Theme 1 Faire Société, which is all about how we live together. And more specifically, resuming in on Acts 2, Liberté et Sécurité. We're going to examine how English-speaking societies have tried to balance these two core values, which, as you'll see, can often be in direct opposition. This right here is going to be our guiding question. Think of it as our North Star. We're going to keep coming back to it throughout our analysis so we can build a really structured answer, just like you would for your baccalaureate. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at how the state responded to terror. Then we'll really weigh the cost to our privacy. After that, we'll dive into the absolutely fascinating case of Edward Snowden, broaden our scope to a global level, and finally, we'll wrap up by equipping you with the analytical tools you're going to need for your exams. Our story really begins in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, 2001. That was a moment that just fundamentally changed the whole conversation around security in the Western world. Okay, take a look at this timeline. It reveals a really stark contrast. Before 9/11, you can see the legislative trend, right? It's a clear move towards protecting individual privacy with things like the Privacy Act and FISA. But then, notice how after 2001, the pendulum just swings dramatically in the other direction. You get the USA Patriot Act, which gave the government these unprecedented powers to monitor its own citizens. So you might be asking, what's the philosophical justification for a shift like that? Well, it often comes back to something called social contract theory. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes argued that to feel secure, we kind of implicitly agree to give up some of our absolute freedom to a government. And in return, that government promises to protect us. The really crucial point here is that after 9/11, the terms of that contract were basically renegotiated. And this quote right here, this shows you the official government position. From their point of view, these new expanded powers weren't an attack on liberty. No, they were a necessary and responsible step to fulfill their end of the social contract, keeping people safe from a new and really unpredictable threat. But what was the cost of this new security-first approach? Well, that brings us right to our second section, where we're going to examine the impact on civil liberties, especially the right to privacy. Okay, this is a really crucial detail, so let's break it down. The U.S. Constitution's Fourth Amendment is there to protect people from unreasonable searches. Now, traditionally, that meant the government needed probable cause, solid evidence, like a witness or physical proof, pointing to a specific person's involvement in a crime before they could get a warrant. The Patriot Act basically lowered that standard, allowing surveillance based on a much broader suspicion that someone was an agent of a foreign power. This made it so much easier for the government to spy on its own citizens. For years, the full extent of all this new surveillance was kept secret. That is, until one man decided to reveal it all to the world, and in doing so, forced a global debate. So let's take a closer look at the case of Edward Snowden. Snowden's actions, as you can imagine, put him right at the center of this huge, fierce debate. On one side, people see him as a heroic whistleblower. He argued that the public had a fundamental right to know about the mass surveillance programs being carried out in their name. But on the other side, the U.S. government labeled him a traitor who broke the Espionage Act, put national security at risk, and committed treason by leaking classified info. Right, let's be really precise with our vocabulary here. A whistleblower is an insider, someone on the inside who exposes misconduct. This is different from just a leaker, because whistleblowing implies a moral or ethical reason for doing it, a belief that the public's right to know is more important than any confidentiality agreements they might have signed. So, here's a great question. Can we classify what Snowden did as an act of civil disobedience? Let's look at the criteria. Civil disobedience usually means breaking a law you think is unjust, doing it openly and nonviolently, and being willing to accept the punishment. Now, Snowden argues that the official channels for reporting this were broken, which made his leak an act of last resort. But, and this is a big but, by fleeing to avoid being prosecuted, he moves away from that traditional model of accepting the consequences. It's a really complex ethical puzzle, isn't it? So this is a question for you to
really analyze. There's no easy yes or no answer here. Weighing the evidence, applying these concepts, that's exactly the kind of critical thinking you need to be doing in your AMC course. Now, it's so important to understand that this debate isn't just an American issue. Not at all. In fact, it's become a global phenomenon. And what's more, it's no longer just about governments. Just look at the United Kingdom. In 2016, they passed the Investigatory Powers Act, which critics nicknamed the Snoopers Charter. It legalized mass data collection and even gave the government the power to force companies to bypass their own encryption. This just shows a parallel trend across the English-speaking world, where security concerns have led to laws that dramatically expand state power. And this brings us to a really fascinating and very contemporary concept: surveillance capitalism. This is basically the business model of companies like Google and Meta. They collect tons of your personal data, not for state security, but to predict your behavior and then sell that predictability to advertisers. But here's the crucial point. The huge pools of data collected by these companies can also be accessed by government agencies, which totally blurs the line between corporate profit and state surveillance. Okay, so we've covered the history, the philosophy, and the contemporary issues. Now for our final section, let's translate all this knowledge into some concrete skills you can use for your baccalaureate. A really strong analysis is built on well-structured paragraphs. I want you to always follow this simple three-step method: idea, example, explanation. Start with your argument, your main point. Then support it with a specific fact or a quote. And finally, and this is the most important part, explain why that evidence proves your point. This method will make sure your writing is always clear, logical, and convincing. Now, to express all these complex ideas with precision, you need the right vocabulary. Here are some key terms I want you to integrate into your essays and oral presentations. Practice using them in context. I promise, they will really elevate the quality of your analysis. So, to finally answer our initial guiding question, anti-terrorism policies have profoundly shifted the balance away from individual freedom and towards collective security. And this has happened through new laws, new technologies, and a new philosophical acceptance of state surveillance, which in turn has sparked this intense debate about the very nature of our social contract. We'll end with a final thought. We've talked a lot about governments and corporations, but now let's bring it all back to you. In a world where your every click can be tracked, what does privacy actually mean to you personally? And as we move forward, what trade-offs are you, as a citizen, willing to make? That is the question your generation is really going to have to answer. Thanks for watching.